Welcome. Good evening. Happy Thursday. You are now viewing our panel discussion program. Tonight, we're going to be discussing Drug Development 101. Before we get started, I just wanted to offer a brief but very heartfelt thanks to our corporate partners as well as our individual donors. Thank you so much. We certainly could not do any of these programs without your support, so thank you. Tonight, we have two exceptional speakers for you. We have the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation's very own Susan Thornton. Susan, thanks for being here with us tonight.
Thanks, Hillary.
Yep, and we also have Michael Young. Michael is one of our wonderful board members, and he is also an accomplished biopharmaceutical executive with award-winning marketing and commercial operations credentials. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Michael.
Happy to do it.
I'm going to pass things over to Susan to get us started, but just a couple housekeeping things very quickly. If you would like to rename yourself on your name, you can do so. We will not have videos on tonight, so no need to have any concerns about privacy for that. If you do have questions during the show, we ask that you use the little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can type any questions in there, or you can chat me privately. And at the end, we will be conducting a few brief questions via a poll, so please participate in that. It helps with our feedback, and we take your feedback very seriously. So please help us out with those. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Michael, are you going to be able to share your screen, or would you like Susan to do it? Oops.
You're on mute.
I think you or Susan were going to advance the slides.
Perfect. Susan, would you like me to do it, or would you like me to?
I think I can do it. We'll see how it goes and make sure that it works properly. All right. Thanks, Hillary. And Michael, really thank you for joining us tonight. As many of you know, and as Hillary said, Michael's one of our board members, but what she didn't mention is that Michael really has been part of the foundation almost since the inception, way back in the day. And really, Michael was instrumental in introducing and opening up the opportunities for Judy Jones, our founder, and myself as well, to connect with the biopharmaceutical industry and with many of the clinicians who are doing research in the field. He's really been a big help for us to be able to keep a handle on what's happening out there in the industry and cutaneous lymphomas, and he's been a guide and a counselor for us all along the way. So, and he brings, as Hillary said, many years of experience in this industry, so he really knows what he's talking about. And we're thrilled to have him here so he can share his knowledge and expertise. And just as a little bit of a setup, and I have to give all of the credit to the slides to Michael. So I thought he did a really great job of taking a dense and kind of really deep and complex topic and putting it into a very interesting way to have a conversation at a high level, because we only have a little bit less than an hour, and to scrunch the whole thing into that time frame is going to be pretty challenging. So our idea tonight is really to give you the 10,000 foot view. It's really just to give you a sense of how drug development works, some of the components, some of the other pieces and parts, with the idea of perhaps if there's interest from all of you, we can take some of these pieces in smaller chunks and do a podcast or a little webinar just on one of the pieces. But tonight we're setting the stage for kind of the high level. So here we are. And I love this picture. Sorry, Michael, were you going to jump in? I was going to say.
No, I was simply going to add, Susan, that for those people who have, thankfully tuned in here, what we're really trying to do is create kind of a survey course, if you will, think back to your school days. And that really the intent here is to make sure that we're taking a patient's point of view and a caregiver's point of view, that it's really not all about all the sciencey stuff and all of the, the technicalities of the government regulations, but to give you an understanding, a little better understanding of how much effort it does take to get something new into the hands of the prescribers, your doctors, and into the pharmacies, and really to make this so that we have new advances in therapy, but at the same time that it's understandable to you.
Right. And so tonight we're taking a little tip from Rachel Ray, and we're going to take all the little bits and pieces and the ingredients and put them in the pot, put it in the oven, and hopefully at the end we're going to get a nice turkey dinner. Right, Michael?
Right, exactly.
So what do we have on the menu tonight? Here are again the high level topics of the things we'll be talking about. Excuse me. So how do medicines get developed? What can you do to help bring them to market faster? A little bit about the role of the FDA. What are those different phases of the clinical trial development, the process that you might have heard about? How do we get involved, and what are some of the other things that we're doing behind the scenes that you may not be aware of? And then a little discussion, and I think this was brilliant, and this was Michael's idea of, the COVID vaccines, how did they get through the process so fast, and what might that mean going forward in what was learned in that process and how we may benefit from that. So that's kind of what we're covering this evening. We're going to do our best to get to the pieces. And like I said, we're not going to deep dive into any one. This is meant to be high level and a little bit of everything. So what are the ingredients for a promising new therapy, Michael? And I don't think it's burgers multiplied, right?
No, but there's no doubt about it that what seemed very, very complicated with the advent of COVID, really people in the drug development world, not only the pharmaceutical side of it, but certainly the research side of it, have said, when you need something in a hurry and it's got to be right and it's got to be good, what can we do to change that? But as we pointed out, Susan, I think you're going to speak to this, is what are the basics that go into this as we know it now?
Right. And I think, it takes a while, right? For things to go from way before they even begin in the testing phase to being available and getting into people's hands. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's see. So I'm going to the next slide. And I know this is a little bit of a busy slide, but it sets up a little bit of these phases of clinical development. Michael, do you want to just do a high level?
Yeah, let me just walk folks through this. So I have no doubt, any of you who have been watching the news over the last year certainly have heard a lot about, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, what actually goes into that. And, remember that the responsibility of the FDA, which is the regulatory body, set by Congress here in the United States to review the safety and the effectiveness of any new medication coming to market. And principally, the FDA functions as really a very large consumer protection agency. Their job is to make sure that all of the drugs have been thoroughly evaluated all the way back to where do the what's called API, the actual ingredients, come from. Are those produced in a safe and reliable fashion? And then how each of those ingredients is put into, if you will, the recipe for each of these drugs. And anytime these drugs are made, that particular drug has to be made to that exact recipe, which means, not only the ingredients, but how long you bake it, or how long you stir it, or how long, at what points do you add broth. All of those things have to come together, and they have to be replicated, repeated exactly the same way every time those drugs are made. And you've heard, like a batch of cookies, there are batches of drugs that are made, and each batch, some of you may have heard that one of the vaccines that's currently available had some unusual number of reactions, but they all seem to come from one batch. And so that batch number, or that actual manufacturing lot, then was pulled out and looked at to make sure that it was all made correctly. So what you have here, and I won't belabor this, but to give you an idea that there are really 5 different phases to development. They go from phase 0, which is really considered your preclinical or laboratory work. And that discovery period can take 3 to 6 years for many of these products. Then it takes another 6 to 7 years to actually go through the phase 1, which basically is your first in human trials. So what you're really looking for here are people who are actually what are called normal, healthy volunteers. I don't know what's normal about volunteering for an unknown drug, but the reality is these studies are generally pretty small, anywhere from 20 to 100 people. And this phase 1 development is really done just to assess how does the drug, when it's taken through the particular route of administration, so whether it's an oral drug or it's a topical drug that's applied as a cream or something that's injected into the body, how does it act when it's in the body? What can we tell about this? And how is it excreted from the body? Do you, frankly, do you pee it out? Or is it metabolized by your liver? Or where exactly, what happens to it along the way? Phase 2 is more of a therapeutic exploratory area where you're really trying to establish the safety of the product. So they'll push the dose till they start to see, reactions from the patients. And really, this is a culmination of really understanding what's the ideal way in which to give the product. And then, of course, phase 3, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, takes the largest number of patients. And it's really a confirmation of whether the drug is actually safe and effective. So does it do what it says it's going to do? So in the instance of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, we want to see that does that drug actually reduce the size of the lesions, reduce the appearance of the rash, reduce the size of tumors, or really is there some sort of effect that is desirable from that drug as it's been designed in the lab. And once phase 3 is done, typically that is when the regulatory body in the United States would be the FDA. In Europe, there is the European Medicines Agency that does this. And in various parts of the world, there are various regulatory bodies to oversee this. But that's typically when they will approve the drug for distribution and marketing in that particular country. So here in the US, the FDA would give marketing authorization, and the product would then be available in your local hospitals and in your local pharmacies. Phase 4 is actually designed to study the drug after it's been marketed. So many times there'll be required additional safety follow-up. And in some cases, they're going to look to see if the drug can be used in other indications. So those are phase 4, and those are done after the drug is actually on the market. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what the phases of clinical development are. And it's certainly much more complex than I've portrayed it, but I just wanted to give you a basic understanding of the fact that it's often a 10-year track by the time a drug is actually identified as being chemically active and might be valuable in a particular disease to the point where it actually comes out onto the market. Does that help, Susan?
Very good explanation. Thank you, Michael. And if you have any questions along the way, just jot them down and we'll do our best to address them at the
Throw them in
end.
the Q&A on the screen and we'll follow up.
Yeah, and if there's a particular part that you find of interest, let us know that too, so that, as I said, we want to be able to do some deeper dives into perhaps some of these components. So now we're kind of cycling back to that phase 0, right, Michael? This is the basic research, the discovery. Right. This is the area where someone thinks they may have found something and that would be worth doing additional studies on. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And there's probably even work that gets done prior almost to this to kind of determine.
Yeah, I agree with
Where
you.
do you look, right?
Exactly. Sometimes, in the quote unquote old days, I would say, prior, it might be interesting to the audience that prior to 1962, when the Kefauver Acts were actually signed by Congress, drugs only had to be shown to be safe. They didn't actually have to be shown to work. So 1962 wasn't that long ago. And in point of fact, today, the way in which we look at drugs is not a matter of just finding something like a flower that grows along the side of the road, or many of you might be aware of the story of penicillin, which was actually discovered in New Jersey in a farm field, basically by a fellow by the name of Dr. Letterly, who kind of stepped in some stuff and grew out this bacteria fighting agent. So those days are largely gone. We still do discover certain things that way, but rational drug design now says that you start with what is the disease, understanding what causes that disease. And today, there's so much more work being done actually at the cellular level and understanding how the DNA somehow gets disrupted and the way in which the body replicates or remakes those particular cells can introduce malignant cells into the system, which then start to grow. So these cancer cells, in this case, these are malignant T cells when we're talking about cutaneous lymphoma. So there are a lot of research tools that go on at the university level and these research institutes. They will be tested in various animal models. They use cell lines. We are now using biomarkers, which are ways of determining which pieces of the molecule might be active. And certainly all this work that you've heard about over the last 10 years or so about the human genome is telling us a tremendous amount about how various diseases get started. And applying these and then building in a specific assay to understand how those things happen, then create the opportunity to develop an actual agent or drug that will stop that from happening. Or in the cases of some of the newer drugs that you're hearing about, like CAR T, these are therapies that are designed to supercharge the human being's actual immune system to help fight off other types of disease. So the last bullet on the top here in the red box is really about patient disease registries. And that's one of the things that's important, especially with rare diseases like CTCL. We often, it's been a long time. Cutaneous lymphoma was first, or mycosis fungoides was first discovered by a French dermatologist by the name of Alibert, I believe in 1870. And, nobody understood what was causing these mushroom-like tumors that happen in advanced stage disease. So putting patient disease registries together is a way of understanding what happens with these these diseases. How do they progress? What do they look like in the beginning? What do they look like as they become real problems? And unfortunately, in many cases with cancers, what do they look like in causing death? So understanding more and more about this, as we have done, and the foundation itself has really gotten involved in trying to help understand the natural course of this disease. So trying to bridge that translational research gap and making sure that we're building bridges to understanding this disease much better. Susan, you might want to talk a little bit about how patients can actually share their voices in this.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I'll just do a little plug for our panel discussion next month, where we will have 3 of our members of our Research Advisory Council on with me to talk about what the foundation's been doing to support that level of preclinical kind of basic research in the field, trying to tease apart how this disease works, how it functions, what's not working, all those things. Anyway, so yeah, so the important thing I think at this juncture for folks to generally be aware of is sometimes you may get asked by your clinicians for permission to share your specimens, like your biopsy tissue or your blood tissue. And a lot of times that is really critical and needed in these early research programs so that the researchers have real human with disease, of course, to be able to pull it apart with all of their beautiful, humongous, amazing microscopes and all that kind of good scientific stuff. But they need real samples in order to do this kind of research and looking at the genomics, looking at what's working at that cellular level. So if you have the opportunity and are asked, I would ask you to really seriously consider being willing to consent to allow your clinicians to use your specimens and in their research. And I think the other piece that is important is, again, consenting to allow your de-identified, so it doesn't necessarily connect to you, but the clinical data that is captured perhaps in the medical record in the institution with the physician that you're seeing, but they strip out all of your personal information so you can't be identified. But that history of your experience with the disease and the treatments and so forth is really important data to be able to pull together from a large group of people to start to look at trends, to see where there might be similarities with maybe, things that are similar with mycosis fungoides, but they might be different in Sézary syndrome. And it really helps the researchers to look at potential prognostic indicators, or again, where are some of these similarities so they can narrow their focus on the research. So I would say those two things: sharing a bit of your physical specimens and then your data is really important. And if you ever have any questions and someone asks you and you don't understand it, let us know. We're happy to try to walk you through it and to get a better understanding of what they might be asking you for. So then we move into preclinical research. So the next step in the phase, Michael.
Yeah, so I won't belabor this here because this is research that's done in the lab, or what they say at the bench. So a lot of these are basic chemistry kinds of tests that are designed to help understand how a particular drug might behave in the body, and then to try and prepare it in a way that is going to, hopefully in the future, perform in a way that we think the drug is going to be most useful. It's a lot of guessing and multiple types of experiments that have to be done here. One of my favorite comics, I have an old Oliphant comic where there's a little lady who is at the pharmacy and asking the pharmacist what her prescription says, because obviously the doctor's written in an illegible scrawl. And he says, "Yes, ma'am, what this says is to take 2 tablets 400 times a day." This is sometimes, we look at the size of these tablets or the capsules, or sometimes we look at the regimens and we don't understand where it comes from. But it actually comes from, we got helpers.
I've got a cat attack. Yeah, I tried to close my door, but he snuck in.
But that's exactly what this research at the bench is designed to do. So it's really designed to say, what's the optimal way to be able to take the medicine that we're thinking about, and to make sure that it doesn't end up being 400 times a day, and it doesn't end up being a tablet that you can't possibly swallow. So, they try as hard as they can on this, but sometimes certain chemicals and medicines don't perform exactly the way we need them to, but that's what all the clinical work is for.
Right. And then again, just from our perspective on the patient side, in addition to what I've already mentioned about sharing your biospecimens and your data, I think the other thing, and if many of you have participated in some surveys that we've sent out and so forth, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. My child is not cooperating.
Well, it means our talk is good because the cat is curious, you know?
Yes. Oh, he just started jumping on my desk and yeah. Anyway, of course he is tonight. Anyway, back to reality. But, we try to gather from you, all of our patient community, what are those areas that are most important? What is impacting your life that may be critical to have a medication dealing with that? So for example, we did last month, introduced you to the folks from ELARAC who have a clinical trial going on, particularly focused on mitigating itch and specific to cutaneous lymphoma. So not in eczema or in any other kind of disease, but specific to cutaneous lymphoma, because we know that's a really big issue for most of us. So being able to share why that's so important, how that impacts our life, then helps to support why a company or a researcher might want to investigate something to address that. So that's another thing where we as the foundation try to gather that information from you so that we can then share that back into the industry to say, hey, this is what's really important to the people who are actually living with this disease.
Yeah, and so I also just would throw in there that we've listed some of the funding sources that go into this this clinical research, preclinical research, especially is there often are great ideas or different mechanisms of action that people think might have value in treating CTCL, for instance, but they need to get the money to do this research. So that funding comes from venture philanthropy. It comes from certain federal and state grants for research that are available. And of course, a big chunk comes from industry support, where pharmaceutical companies, in exchange for the opportunity to develop the drug eventually and market it, may get behind somebody to provide initial seed funding. And of course, not unlike the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation, we have provided various nonprofit grants for specific researchers to get them to specific conferences to make sure that they can join in the understanding. So really, again, the CLF is very, very focused on advancing this research and getting more cures for all of us.
Right. Exactly. And I was going to say something else and it now escapes me. Oh, I think I was going to mention, when you talk about federal and state grants, many people may have heard about the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and a lot of those clinical research grants that are supplied to researchers at the various academic institutions, maybe some of the physicians who you might be seeing. I think I'm going to have a friend for the rest of the program. But, a lot of them will apply for funding from the National Institutes of Health, which that money comes out of the federal budget. So when you hear every year that, or, Congress is doing the budget and the NIH funding is up for grabs as part of the federal budget, that's where a lot of this money goes as well. So just to try to tie a few other things into how all these pieces fit together, because it's a pretty intricate web of components. Okay, clinical research. Now we're in the phase 1, 2, 3, right?
Right, exactly. And I'll be quick here in terms of just reinforcing that there are generally 4 phases. This is the research that's done in human beings to determine the safety and effectiveness. So this means groups of patients who may be experiencing various stages of cutaneous lymphoma will often be offered an opportunity to get into a clinical trial. These trials are done in progressively larger groups of patients, as I showed you on that other previous green slide. and that these drugs are rigorously evaluated to achieve statistical significance. So if you ever wonder how many patients need to be added to each of these phases, it's all based on a calculation of how many patients would we need to study in order to determine what's considered a statistically significant difference between the placebo group or the control group and the treated group. This is often reflected in what's called a p-value. And so a lot of statistical mathematical stuff that my professors back in undergrad didn't think I did very well with are often engaged here to really determine, does that drug really actually make a difference or doesn't it? But an important note here is that most of the oncology trials do not have a placebo or a no treatment group, or for those of you who think about this, the sugar pill group, okay? That really would be unethical to take a patient with a diagnosis of cancer and not give them anything. So if you ever wonder about getting into a clinical trial, you're not going to be treated with nothing, but are instead going to be treated with the current best standard of care. So typically the control group is getting what the most beneficial regimen that is known would be, and then they're going to be tested against a group who's receiving the experimental therapy.
Right. Which, and I'll just say, ends up being a little bit tricky in our space because we don't have a lot of therapies that have been in use to compare, right? So that's also sometimes a little bit of the challenge when you're trying to do an oncology trial where you're comparing standard of care, like you said, Michael, the drug that is used in this particular instance, because that's what's available, against something that might be new. And the other challenge becomes for us, because of the smaller patient populations, particularly when you get into more advanced disease. And if you remember on Michael's green slide, you had more and more people as you went through the phases. Well, we will never have thousands of people in a phase 3 trial for cutaneous lymphoma. There's just not that many people typically, especially for more advanced disease. So the trials have to be international, and that adds an interesting component, because when you're doing this comparator, not all of the drugs that have been available or created or approved here in the US for cutaneous lymphoma were actually made available in other countries. So it's very interesting. I've learned so much over the last many years in the complexity of how this all works, and then trying to, again, figure out how we as the patient community can best contribute to bringing new treatments into our space. What kinds of data can we share? And again, it goes back to all of us being willing to share the clinical data that gets captured about us, put into that big database, like I mentioned, de-identified, of course. When we ask our community to answer some questions or participate in a specific focus group or ask, it's really important, because that information then gets kind of sent back and put into the mix. And I would say in the last, probably in the last 3 to 5 years, but really in the last 3 years, the value that's being put on the patient perspective, the patient experience from organizations at the regulatory level, like the FDA, and the biopharma companies themselves, really wanting to understand what is that patient experience. And that is now becoming a big component of this whole process. And it's really critical, I think. And and that part is all new. It's still evolving. There's, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's what we're doing to try to stay engaged in that discussion as well, and figure out how do we play the best role. But again, I would just say, if you have an opportunity to engage or share your data or share your experience, I would really highly recommend you consider it, because that's a way that you as an individual can really help move these things forward.
Yeah,
Anyway.
absolutely. And I think that the fact that the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation actually serves as an active agent or voice for this community is really critical, because the drug development world has a qualified and a valid organization to talk to in order to understand more about the natural history of the disease, to understand the needs of the patient. And what Susan's talked about here is really, in the industry, is referred to as patient centricity. And more drug programs or drug development programs are incorporating the needs and the desires of the patients up front, so that the ultimate drug that comes out at the other end, like I said, not only is something that you can take conveniently and will work well for you, but also fits into the active lifestyle of most cutaneous lymphoma patients today. The vast majority of whom, especially with early stage disease, need to go to work, need to take care of their families, need to be able to shop and to enjoy life. And that those things often, certainly in the 1950s and 60s, weren't considered when you developed a drug. So this slide really talks to how completing these clinical trials is really hard work. And this may shock you, but 2/3 of the US clinical trials fail to meet their original patient recruitment goals, which then obviously delays or prevents the life-saving medications from coming to market. This is a persistent and challenging problem. And while not all of you who are listening or will watch this in the future might be eligible for a clinical trial, if the opportunity is there for you to participate, I hope that you'll take the time to understand what might be involved and what value it not only could do for your own treatment, but certainly will be meaningful for those who come after you.
Yeah, and I will actually just say that since I've been in this role with the foundation now going on 11 years, I can't believe that, but we've had at least 2 that I'm aware of drugs that were in the phase, I think one was phase 3 and one might have been in phase 2, I can't really remember, but because it took so long to fulfill the trials, the investors were not willing to wait, and they basically pulled the plug on the funding, and the company had to make a decision about should we stay, should we go, and sadly those 2 drugs are now on a shelf somewhere, and we never got it through the process. So from my perspective, one of the other goals is for us as the foundation to really stay on top of what's happening with all the different clinical trials in our space, and to let all of you know what's available to the best of our capacity. With 5 people on the staff, sometimes that's a little hard to do. But again, this is why we want to bring some of this information to you through these kinds of vehicles, so that you can become more aware, because I think from all of our perspectives, we want to find a way to eradicate this disease. I don't know if that will happen in my lifetime, but if we can at least take some of these promising therapies and the research that's happening and pull it forward, I believe there will be a day when maybe the foundation doesn't even need to exist, right? Because there's nobody that needs our services anymore. So that would be great. Put myself out of a job, but I probably won't be on the planet by then.
Well, obviously there are some frustrations and hurdles along the way. There are great success stories. There are many patients that we are aware of who've participated, and those drugs are now available today. In fact, the founder of the foundation, Judy Jones, participated in a very big trial that was done on a drug called Ontac. And so there are, many reasons to participate. Just to help the viewing audience here understand more about, how difficult this is. there are about 40,000 living patients in the United States that have been diagnosed with CTCL of various stages, including Sézary. And out of that, most of these trials are being attempted to be done in 50 to 100 patients or so, or a few more. Even some of the largest trials that have been done, like the mogamulizumab trial, or in the past, are about 150 to 200 patients in many cases. And those trials are taking anywhere from 2 to 3 to as much as 7 years to actually complete the trial, just because there are so few patients that are available to it. So again, it's a very personal decision to get involved, but I encourage all of you to think about the future, and how, in talking with your caregiver, your physician, how you might be able to participate in some of these trials that are being done.
Great. And I'll diverge here from that just to share, and I've been chatting a little bit about this, and this is such a lovely picture of our wonderful, wonderful board and some of the clinicians. A few of you might recognize Michael, Dr. Yan Kim, Dr. Lauren Pinter-Brown, Marianne Tawa. So we're really lucky to have such amazing folks guide and direct the foundation and be on the board as part of the board and our medical advisory council, as well as our research advisory council. It's a really wonderful connected community with everyone that's involved. But back again with the foundation, what a lot of the things that we do in the background that we don't always have a chance or have a great vehicle way of sharing it, is keeping a finger on the pulse of what's happening at the regulatory bodies like the FDA or the EMA, and how they are soliciting, quite frankly, feedback from the patient community as a whole on how should clinical trials be created, what should some of those parameters be, sometimes because of, especially in a rare disease like ours, the patient populations are small. So really being able to have a dialogue with the regulatory agents to say, this is challenging to bring a new treatment to market if you're going to require thousands of individuals to be enrolled when you don't have that many people, or creating new methodologies. And I think Michael will talk a little bit about this too, and some of the learnings from COVID, but are there other ways that clinical trials can be made available to individuals who are eligible and interested in participating that may not live nearby the major academic center that is hosting the trial? So, bringing all those pieces together, we're keeping our ear on the ground so that we're listening to the FDA and saying, what's the patient perspective? And we get to bring your perspective to the table and hopefully make some changes. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process, but the fact that they're willing and open to listening is really, really important. And we do the same on the policy level, both in the US and in other countries, particularly in Europe and in Canada. Europe and Canada has different methodologies for even once their regulatory bodies approve a new medication. In Europe, every country goes through a process called the health technology assessment, and a review of whether or not that country will incorporate that drug onto their formulary and into their health system. And there are requirements both in Europe and in Canada where they solicit information from patients who have been on that particular drug to add to their mix when they're making decisions about making these drugs accessible and available to the patients in those countries. So we are really just beginning to become way more active in that process. But you may have noticed lately, we've been sending out some surveys for folks that have been on certain drugs that are now in the process of gaining that reimbursement approval in other countries. And it's really important that we bring your voice to the table so that gets included in the overall review process. And then, here in the US, I was just participating in an updated policy call today. We're a member of a number of coalitions and larger organizations that are keeping track of policy initiatives. And, it's everything from, access and reimbursement to what gets covered under Medicare and Medicaid versus commercial insurance. As new laws are proposed in Congress in the healthcare arena, bringing the patient perspective to what the impact of that law, should it go forward, may have, raising that awareness. We can't do that on our own. If you've ever tried to read any legislation that has come out of our congressional offices, it's pretty complex, but there are people that know how to read that and then interpret it and say, here's what it says. And then we read it and say, oh yeah, that could potentially have an impact on our patient population. Here's why. And yes, we will add our voice to that. And we're part of a group called the Haystack Project, which is a small collaborative umbrella organization specifically targeting the United States access and reimbursement for rare diseases. And we have authored and brought to the floor 2 new bills. And don't ask me what they are off the top of my head, but I do think we had an article in our last forum, a little article about that. So those are some of the other ways that we're working behind the scenes to try to stay on top of all these things. It's complicated, but there's things happening with the Cures Act and renewals for some of the funding for the FDA through something called user fees. And so all these kinds of things, we keep an ear to the ground and try to understand them and then extrapolate them to what the impact is for us, and then send our voices back. So we might reach out to you and say, hey, do you have an experience in this particular area that you'd be willing to share? Or are you having trouble in this area? And we can collect that, add it to a bigger voice with a number of other patient organizations who have similar issues. And then that gives us a lot more power in the policy and regulatory arena. So we're doing all those things kind of in the background. And hopefully going forward as capacity and, funding allows us to be able to do more, and to really be able to find ways that you as an individual can engage and learn more about this whole process, because it's fascinating and wonderful. And it's a good way for us as lay people to really have an impact. So,
Yeah, Susan, I'll just add to that by saying that, we often talk about how small the organization is. That's typical of a lot of these rare disease organizations, but we have probably one of the more effective teams here in actually doing the watchdog activity at the government level to really make sure that we are ears to the ground, but more than that, that we are constantly advocating for what's going to be best for the patients. So that means doing things like we've noted here that, when there are live meetings or even virtual meetings that happen at the clinical congresses and sessions, I know that you and I, as far as the foundation are concerned, we do a lot of work, listening to what's happening, not only in new therapies coming along, but as relates to various legislation, as you're pointing out, as well as different protocols and the way in which patients will be affected. So these are all parts of how the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation helps assure that patients who come to us get the best care possible. That's literally our purpose.
Exactly. Well said, Michael. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what we've already got on the table, right? Just to mention kind of where we are at the moment.
Yeah, and we won't spend a lot of time on this because I think many of the people in the audience are certainly very familiar with what they're being treated with. But for family members, et cetera, just to give a little perspective to this, that prior to 1999, and I kind of got involved in this world back in 1995, prior to 1999, there were very, very few options. In fact, most of the options were really not good. They typically involved some pretty powerful and unfortunately fraught with side effects chemotherapy. And much of that chemotherapy was really designed, as much of the cancer therapy was in the mid 90s, was really around how do we kill that tumor before we kill the patient. And so fortunately, since then, so much more has become understood about how cutaneous lymphoma actually spreads, how it manifests. We don't know what causes it yet, but we certainly do understand much more about what can be done. So on the right-hand side, without naming all of them, you can see there, all of these therapies have come to pass here since 1999. So we're making much better progress on having an armamentarium of, if you will, a quiver of arrows that can be used by physicians who are treating this disease. And I think the other thing that's happened as a result of all of this drug discovery and drug development is there are many more physicians today that are very capable and very involved in the treatment of CTCL. You know, Susan, when way back when you got started on the board, even before you became the CEO, we had large parts of the US in which there was nobody that actually treated this disease. So people were having to travel literally hundreds and hundreds of miles to just find somebody who knew what they what there was to be able to be used. So I happen to be, you know, personally very proud and having been connected with a number of these drugs that have come to market, and actually naming a couple of them. So at any rate, this will give you an idea that in the kitchen, we are now able to serve quite a bit more of a diverse menu than we had before.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's so true. And you know, when I was diagnosed in 1991, I can attest to, you know, when I was going through and struggling with the really challenging time frame of my disease, which was probably 95 to 1998. There was none of, let's see, really, maybe ONTAC. I don't even, you know, there wasn't much on this list available.
No.
And so I didn't have a lot of options. And I think one of the other exciting things that has happened over the course of these last 20 some years is we're learning how we can use these treatments either, you know, I always say like mix and match, but you know, in some, maybe some combinations, you know, a topical with a systemic agent or one after another, or, you know, and that's where some of this post-market, after the drugs are approved and in use, come into play. That's where some of those clinical studies come into play to say, wow, these two drugs seem to have a synergistic effect. Can we use them together in a way that enhances their effectiveness? So that's, to me, another really exciting next steps, right? So the more things we have in our armamentarium, the more options we may have to kind of do this plug and play and go back and forth, and which really gives us a lot more options. It broadens that toolbox. So, and then I think you're going to talk a little bit about what's kind of give everybody a little update on what's on the docket.
Obviously, even though we've got a nice long list of therapies to use, none of them are curative. So
right.
The search continues, the work continues, the effort needs to be there. And certainly there are many, many other large tumor types, cancers. There are, you know, some 270 different kinds of cancer out there. And CTCL being an indolent or a slow growing, usually non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is just one of them. But we've got some great news. So I served it up kind of as dessert here. There are new therapies coming. Some are in late stage development, including drugs, as you see on the left, that are designed for early stage disease. These are not necessarily drugs that are in early stage of development, but in early stage of treatment, including synthetic hypericin, SGX-301, which is advancing very rapidly, and some of the others as well on more advanced stage disease. If you'll see on the right, there are a lot of drugs that can be used for later stage CTCL. Susan and I were both in Barcelona just literally before the COVID shutdown. So I consider, Valentine's Day, February of last year to 2020 BC, as I call it, before COVID. We learned a lot about these various therapies. And since that time, over the last year, we've been keeping in touch through some of these virtual congresses, such as ASCO, and now the just past ASH meeting, the American Society of Hematology meeting. So more is coming, and that's great news. So, the kitchen is not closed.
Yes, which is really, really good news. And we're doing our best to stay engaged with the companies that are in the field and be able to provide you with their clinical trial information if they have it, and keeping track of where they are in their phases of development, so that we can bring you that information as well. Again, a lot of times things change, but we do our best to stay engaged. And I think that's the other important piece, and why it's important for us to also participate in these congresses. The World Congress of Cutaneous Lymphomas, that is only the third one, right? Or no, it was the fourth one. Fourth
Yeah.
one. And this to me is like, some people might be excited to go to Hollywood and see Hollywood stars. For me, this is like my Hollywood, because this is everybody who's anybody in the world of cutaneous lymphoma, names like Dr. Duvek and Dr. Olson and Dr. Rook. Like there are people that have been in this space for a long time, providing their knowledge and their expertise and sharing amongst everyone around the world. It's everybody from around the globe. And I will say, this last year at this Congress was the largest ever. And I want to say there were over 400 or 500 individuals. And quite frankly, everybody there is doing something in the world of cutaneous lymphoma, which is amazing. And they're so dedicated. And then what was also exciting from my perspective was the number of younger folks who are participating, who were presenting their data, their studies, and becoming engaged in the field, because people do retire sometimes from clinical practice. We have to allow our physicians to leave the field, even though I would hope none of them will, but they will, right? So, it's really important to have this ongoing, bringing the new generations in. And
yeah, that's very, very true. We, through the work that the foundation does, and through our medical advisory board, et cetera, we need to constantly be looking for, and that's why we promote, the efforts of younger physicians, because time is a big factor. And speaking of time, I know we're going to run out of time here.
Of course we are. So I think this is our last slide. And I know this was a really interesting one. The question with regards to, wow, how did, the COVID vaccine was turned everybody, turned the whole industry on its head to get something so quickly, which is great. But what might some of those impacts be for us, I think, going forward, some of the lessons that have been learned through this experience, this global experience of creating vaccines that may now have, I hope, a positive impact on the rest of the drug development world going forward. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll add this here with a caveat that I know we're probably running over time, and so those of you who
Oops.
end up taking the survey, et cetera, please feel free to come back and watch the rest of this when this is posted to the website. Um, but the fact of the matter is, you can see on the left that historically, many of the vaccines that have been developed, and this is kind of a track that happened from the late 1800s, take a considerable amount of time to, actually complete. The little teeny dot that you see at the very bottom is the COVID-19 vaccine trial period. And you'll see that that little dot really comprises about 9 months time. So why were we able to do this? And what are the implications for CTCL drugs? And I'll just briefly go to this to say that, we were really able to develop all of this so quickly because of all the years of experience of learning that we had before this. So those of you who got a polio vaccine in a sugar cube, or those of you who got a tetanus shot in the last few years, all of that knowledge was incorporated into what we are doing. And we saw years of this scientific research being applied. So we've had incredible leaps of knowledge. It is without a doubt the amount of attention and money that was poured into this. It hasn't been spoken of as much, but the US government and private industry, the pharmaceutical world, put literally billions of dollars of funding in order to run all these multiple trials in parallel. So as I mentioned to you, each of these vaccines took somewhere between 30 and 40,000 patients to be treated in order to assess safety and efficacy. There were over 800 research programs that were actually done, and almost 200 of those were devoted purely to new vaccines. So, when you've got this incredible number of shots on goal, it makes a huge difference in what's able to come around. Now, because these collaborations that were international in nature, as well as between small companies and large companies, between the government and the industry, all working together to end this scourge, this is a model for the future. And if we have the ability to apply our learnings here, they might not be on the scale of COVID, but you can imagine that collaborations and multiple efforts with ultimately more money funding research in cutaneous lymphoma could result in new treatments much faster. And we hope that you will contribute to that as well as participate in that. Susan, I think there's one more slide.
Yeah, and now my screen is stuck.
Okay, there we go. Whoop, there we go.
Wait, there we go. Yeah, it's when it's the, when you put it in the play mode, it just gets kind of funky. Yeah, struggling here a little bit with my technology. I apologize, everyone. I'm not the best. Anyway, so, we talked.
Yeah, just to make sure that we understand that, there are things we can do to speed up the development of more drugs for cutaneous lymphoma. Even though this is a very rare disease, I mentioned to you the 40,000 people living with the disease. There's only about 1,500 newly diagnosed patients per year. So if you can imagine, with a US population of over 330 million people, 1,500 patients is not very many. But this is considered an orphan disease or a rare disease. There are ultra rare diseases in which there are literally only 10 or 12 patients in the entire United States. So research can continue to be here. We really hope that you will let your voice be heard. Talk to your congressman and your state representatives about more research into these skin cancers. You yourselves, if you have the opportunity to volunteer or learn more about active advocacy opportunities, talk to us here at the foundation. We're happy to get you engaged. And obviously, the one thing that makes a lot of this move is raising funds. So we've got to do more for research. We've got to do more to help spread the word. And in order to support patients in need of information and support, we are grateful for any contributions and donations, whether done, today or in, gifts later to the foundation. And we put the giving link in here so that you can do that. So small or large, we can always use your help.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Michael. And stay tuned next month when we'll dive into a little more detail with our beloved Research Advisory Council members about the research that we are hosting, conducting, and funding. And you'll learn a little bit more about what we're doing within the foundation and supporting those researchers. So stay tuned for that. Let's see. So I think that is it. I'm going to unshare my screen. I think I can do that. Can I do that? All right. What happened here? Did I unshare my screen? There we go.
You did.
All right. Gosh.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was wonderful. And we have people commenting here. Thank you so much. It was so informative. Sorry we ran over a little bit, but we just wanted to make sure we shared all of the information we had tonight. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Susan. And everybody, if you would like to rewatch this, or if there's a portion of the program you wanted to see, it will be posted on our website. Check back within a week, it should be up there. And you can feel free to watch it as many times as you'd like. I'm sure you'll learn something new every time. And as you saw in the polls, and as Susan had mentioned at the beginning, we will be sharing and expanding on this program. So stay tuned for more information on that. And just a quick heads up here, we have 2 more programs coming up. On February 18th, we'll be hosting a webinar on skincare. That'll be at 6:00 p.m. Eastern time. And then we will also be hosting a webinar on focusing on our research roadmap on March 3rd, and that will be at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So we hope you'll be able to join us for both of those. Thank you again to the two of you. I don't know if you have any final thoughts to share.
No, I just appreciate everybody's interest. It's a complex topic, and I hope that we'll be able to share more in small chunks and in areas where people are interested. So we'd love to hear from you on the topics that would be most interest, so that we can then create the right kind of a program to address that. Yeah.
And Susan, I'll say that, even if we didn't touch on it or cover it tonight, if there are other aspects of whether it's, medicine development or a way in which people are accessing treatment, or questions that they have, obviously, and when it comes to individual treatment, we will refer you back to your own physician for that. But in terms of the overall trends and the ways in which things are done, the foundation is here to help you understand what options you've got for yourself. And we are grateful for your participation.
Yeah. Yes. And it's always fun to be here. So.
And it's always wonderful to see your face. And I just put my email in the chat there for anybody. If you have any topics you would like to hear more about, feel free to shoot me an email. So thank you so much. This does conclude our evening program, and we hope to see you again soon, hopefully on their February 18th webinar. And be well, and we hope to see you all soon. Have a great night.
Good night, everybody.
Be safe, everybody.
Take good care.
Bye-bye.
Says good night too.